liberal friends is not that they're ignorant. It's just that they know so much that isn't so.
Ain't nobody trailblazing. Rap game is in a stale placing. Sales looking like snails racing. All the males ain't men. Hold their fingers up to hail Satan. Bet them niggas got their nails painted. It's an agenda. Everybody thinking they could change their gender. I could join the WNBA and play center. Just identify as a they, them. And if it makes sense, then they censor. It's a brain bender. Internet feel like a hive mind. We need protection from text, speech, a high crime. Reject the TOS and be arrested. See, the best thing you could do is respect the fucking guidelines. Pro-establishment, these activists are full of it. Act like they compassionate, but that's a bunch of Bolshevik. Fascists are in fashion, see they capping from the look of it. Leninists are really menaces, there ain't no benefits to Marxism. I don't even feel like rhyming, it's Marxism. If you seek it, then you'll find out it's Marxism.
Well, I too don't feel like rhyming. I am Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Abbott, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. And the voice that you just heard was, I don't know, some guy doing a rap about Marxism. And he seemed to think it had something to do with the terms of service on social media platforms and trans people and some other stuff. I don't know. There was a lot there. But I have a different take on what Marxism is all about. So I've been teaching this class on Capital. We're actually going to be going through all 3 volumes right now. We're in chapter 15 of volume 1. So this is something, people can join at any time. And last week, there was a little chunk where we were going through the kind of what had happened in the book so far and how it fit together. And it occurred to me that for anybody who's interested, this was a pretty good overview of what's been going on in the class. So we're going to watch that. And then we're going to be showing the interview with Danny Bessner and Derek Davison of the American Prestige podcast. But first, Capital.
Yeah, don't worry, Ben. I put that instrumental, the fire instrumental, under this on a loop, so you can put your bars against his. Actually, I did like the instrumental that he used. I felt like that Jay-Z GIF where he's just like apprehensively bobbing his head. But the lyricism was maybe left some to be desired.
Yeah. I think politics aside, that is correct.
That's a weak
14 flow. In some ways is deceptively simple, but I think it's going to be useful to take a beat here and think a little bit more analytically about how it's going to fit into what Marx is doing in the overall scheme of the book. Because at the very end of the chapter, like the very end, the last paragraph, he's talking about factory machinery. And there's something here that can feel a little bit odd, depending on how you're looking at it. Here's what I mean. Any number of books about economics just kind of treat the dynamics of modern capitalist society as if they were eternal features of any kind of human production process. God knows the Econ 101 textbook I can remember from being an undergraduate did that. And also, of course, as you guys know very well, this many chapters deep into Capital, that's also one of Marx's big complaints about the treatises of the bourgeois political economists he's reacted against in this book. Like even in Robinson Crusoe thought experiments, they import various things about 19th century British capitalism because they just can't step outside of that. So Marx doesn't want to do that. He wants to historicize, to, in other words, analyze the economy of his day, not as an eternal human phenomenon, but as a specific phase in human history. So far, so good. But look, if you're sitting on your perch in 1867, thinking about what makes the economic processes around you different from what existed at various earlier phases of history. The Romans with their water wheels, for example, which Marx talks about in this chapter. You might think that the very first thing you notice is that rather than people mostly working from their homes or, some sort of like individual semi-detached workshop with a few tools, large groups of people were gathered together in factories using modern machinery to make stuff, right? I mean, that's like certainly if aliens visited Earth during the Roman Empire and then they visited again in 1867 and there were, what's the first thing you would notice about how humans produce things differently, right? I mean, that would certainly be at the top of the list. But it actually takes Marx 14 full chapters to get up to the edge of talking about modern industrial machinery. Again, he's setting it up in the very last paragraph of chapter 14, which we'll obviously get to. I mean, it's come up earlier in the book, for sure, especially in the context of chapter 10 and the struggle for a shorter working day. But this is the first time he's actually putting the sort of main analytical spotlight of the book on industrial machinery per se. So why is that? Why does it take so long? And while we're thinking about that, it's worth highlighting a sentence that clarifies a lot about what's going on in chapter 14, though you do have to wade through most of the chapter to get there. So he says almost at the end of the chapter, right, almost at the end of 14.5, that when he talks about manufacture, quote, I am not referring here to large-scale industry, which is based on machinery. So once you've gotten this distinction clear in your head, all of Marx's talk about the manufacturing period starts making a lot more sense. In the 21st century, we tend to use manufacturing and industrial production as synonyms, lobbying organizations for employers that fight against minimum wage increases and, try to make things harder for labor unions and such are called manufacturers associations, for example. And, we certainly talk about, for example, General Motors manufacturing cars. But Marx is using the word manufacturing in an older sense. The etymology of manufacturing is from the Latin manufactum, made by hand, the same way that like manicure is from manuscura, care of the hand. So in Marx's sense, the manufacturing period is the period of capitalist development where formerly independent craftsmen have been reduced to the status of wage laborers, and their employers have captured those economies of scale that he was talking about in chapter 13 on cooperation by bringing a bunch of them together under one roof to do their work together. But the work is still being done by hand. And sometimes he'll also distinguish between manufacturing and simple cooperation, where manufacturing, presumably the distinction is about the division of labor. And a lot of his historicization of the work of Adam Smith, who he refers to a bunch of times in this chapter, especially in the footnotes, has to do with Smith being like the ultimate theorist of the manufacturing period. And to think about how Marx's discussion of this is going to finally set up his discussion of the most blindingly obvious difference, we said, between the economy of his day and the economy of the Romans or the medievals, which is the use of modern industrial production, we need to take a long step back and think about the overall structure of this book. One of the big things I think is going to strike any first-round Capital reader is that the book can seem like a weird mixture of history and some reasoning that's so abstract it's almost a priori. For the dedicated philosophy nerds in the class, I think it's not quite literally a priori, because even Marx's most abstract arguments generally have a foundation in some kind of observed data, like wildly heterogeneous commodities often have the same exchange value. But certainly when you're in chapter 1, it can feel almost like you're reading a treatise about metaphysics. Marx himself makes that, kind of half ironic reference to the uh, metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties of commodities and money. And he goes back and forth a bit between these two modes as the book goes on, very abstract theorizing and close reading of the historical record, or at least, as in parts of this chapter, in areas where there isn't a lot of historical record to work with, at least plausible speculations about historical causation, like, okay, do we have tribes first or families first? And sometimes, at any rate, we're thoroughly in empirical observation mode, and sometimes we're explicitly abstracting away features of empirical reality for the sake of analytical clarity. And it's legitimate to be confused about how it all fits together, though I think it actually does fit pretty smoothly once you get a good sense of what Marx is up to. So the whole project of the book is to understand capitalism, what it is, how it arose, how it works, and how we might one day get past it, inshallah. Marx doesn't think that the use of modern industrial machinery is what makes capitalism capitalism. As you're seeing in these chapters, capitalism existed, without industrial machinery in the past. And of course, his whole project is to try to disentangle the two by creating a more egalitarian and democratic, but still economically abundant in a way that we need modern industrial production for kind of society in the future. So obviously Marx thinks the two can and have, and one hopes will come apart, but that certainly isn't to say that he sees the existence of modern heavy industry, even in the 1867 sense of modern heavy industry, coinciding with the capitalist phase of history. He doesn't see that as a coincidence. Far from it. His materialist theory of history tells him that new economic systems displace old ones precisely because they're so much better at enabling further development of the forces of production. And in these chapters we're going through right now, he's telling a very specific story about how and why capitalists revolutionized the production process, first by capturing the economies of scale due to cooperation, and then with the division of labor and manufacture, and finally, in the chapter we're about to read, with the introduction of machinery and large-scale industry, all in order, as he says in chapter 14, to expand the sphere of surplus labor, right? The extra hours that workers are working to enrich the capitalist rather than working for themselves. But the use of manufacture and large-scale industry, or for that matter, just the use of division of labor for, what had been unitary handicrafts, once you get to the manufacturing period, or even the productive benefits of cooperation in the first place, aren't what make capitalism capitalism. Capitalist production is going on when a bunch of individual Uber drivers who never meet each other are being exploited by the same company, or when a bunch of adjunct professors on their individual laptops are generating profits from one of those, shady for-profit universities, right? The ITT Tech or the University of Phoenix or whatever, no less than when 200 workers are gathered together in the same roof to make cars. And an analysis of what makes capitalism capitalism often proceeds by, right? So Marx's analysis, to be clear, of what makes capitalism capitalism often proceeds by temporarily pretending some feature doesn't exist. That's what we mean by abstracting away, in order to get a better understanding of what's left in the picture without complicating it with that. The same way like a word problem in a math or physics class often proceeds by getting rid of complications that are going to come up in real cases, right? Assume a perfectly spherical cow. And then the theoretical tools honed through that more abstract reasoning are going to be used to analyze the dynamics of the real history. So way back in part one, we were abstracted away from capitalist class relations entirely to just talk about markets and money per se. as the vice president's father wisely observed in the paper we talked about a while ago, simple commodity production isn't some period of actually existing human history, because really, when would that have been? Of course, lots of individuals have engaged in simple commodity production, making their own goods and selling them without employing anybody throughout the history of all market societies, up to and including the year 2024. But there's never been a society of generalized simple commodity production. Rather, that idea is a simplification so we can think about the dynamics of markets and money without all the complications that come from wage labor and everything that goes with it, which of course is going to be the main subject of the rest of the book. And a big part of Marx's point in those earlier chapters is to push back against both defenders of capitalism, who think markets being unleashed to do their thing without interference would make everything hunky-dory, and those critics of capitalism who thought, mistakenly in his view, that the big problem with capitalism was that capitalists, rig the rules, they violate the rules of market fairness in their dealings with workers, that maybe something about exchange being mediated through money rather than just labor time being explicitly exchanged for labor time, tricks workers into selling their labor for less than its full value. Instead of any of that, Marx strives to argue in those earlier chapters that there's nothing special about money, that it's just a very convenient commodity that makes it easier to trade other commodities. And in that discussion, he comes away with his first big theoretical tool, which is his theory of value, which he goes on to use in part two, I think not in the way that a lot of people think he does, that, the theory of value is just going to give you his theory of what exploitation is exactly. But rather, what he's trying to show is that the thing that's exploitative about capitalism, the thing that makes it fundamentally similar to earlier class societies like slavery and feudalism, has nothing to do with some sort of sneaky money trickery that's being used in place of the outright force that serfs and slaves were subjected to, that it's not a matter of workers somehow being defrauded into selling their labor for less than its full value. In fact, while he drops the simplifying assumption from part one that everyone's doing simple commodity production, that there's no wage labor, right? Starting in part two, he's talking about wage labor. He's still making a massive simplifying assumption here, which is that all commodities, all commodities, very much including labor power, in other words, the capacity of workers to labor during given hours, which is the commodity that Marx thinks workers are selling capitalists, all of these commodities, including that one, are being sold at their full value. Again, he knows that's not always true, but he assumes that for the sake of simplicity and to show that even assuming that, his point about capitalist exploitation still goes through. And he thinks he's shown that just like serfs and slaves were forced to do hours of unpaid labor, proletarians are essentially forced to do hours of unpaid labor, even with this assumption in place. And so when he moves into history in part three, what he's doing is he's seeing how the analytical tools he's produced through this much more abstract reasoning in parts 1 and 2 can illuminate the actual dynamics of the real society that was, sweating and bleeding in the streets of London outside of Marx's study. And sure, he knows those dynamics include a lot of labor power being sold at less than its value, even in his sense, which he gets into. But he thinks the more abstract reasoning in those earlier parts of the book has uncovered a more basic motor of what's going on that has nothing to do with that, right? That might also be true, right? The capitalists push labor down below its historically determined standard of subsistence. But that's not what makes workers exploited. Rather, the combination of basic facts about how markets work that we looked at in part 1 and the existence of a class of propertyless laborers desperate enough to sell their labor to the owners of the means of production that he directs our attention to in part 2 And in with that scene at the market where the labor power owner meets the money owner as equals, and they leave as master and wage slave. This is the combination that gives rise to workers being forced by the dull compulsion of material circumstances to do hours of unpaid labor for the capitalists, like serfs and slaves were forced to do by means of a much more personal kind of compulsion. And what's different about capitalism from these earlier forms of class society is, again, in part 3, going to be explained by those basic dynamics of markets we explored in the first 2 parts of the book, that rather than just being exploited to produce use value for the master class, workers are being exploited to produce exchange value for the never-ending cycle of MCM prime accumulation. And that's where you get that vampiric thirst for more surplus labor time that really is relatively unique to the capitalist phase of history. But as part 3 ends, we observe, and this is an empirical issue, that there are limits in practice to how much surplus labor time the vampires of capital can suck by expanding the parameters of the working day. The absolute limit, of course, is 24 hours. That's just, astronomy. But even within that, there are physical limits to what workers can take. And then class struggle ends up imposing limits that are even more restrictive than that. So thinking about the pattern of the book, you might think, okay, so we started out honing these theoretical tools with relatively abstract reasoning. Then we went into real history to apply them. Then we run into an analytical problem. You might think that next we'd do some chapters where we're back in abstract reasoning land, building up new tools to deal with the new problem. But that's not really what happens when we move into part 4, where we're at right now. Marx has already given us almost all of what we need at this point on the abstract level. So it's the work of a single chapter, even with quite a bit of belaboring of the point, to show us the necessary sort of abstract insight that earlier we'd established that the working day is divided up into hours of necessary labor, where the worker's working to reproduce his own wage packet. That's the line segment from A to B. And then on the other hand, surplus labor, that's the B to C line segment, where the workers working to enrich the capitalist. And so capitalists can expand their profits by keeping the necessary where it is, no change in the gap from A to B. In fact, that's part of his assumption, that labor power is continuing to be bought at its full market value as established historically, right? That gives you that full A to B. But they're expanding the surplus labor gap from B to C, right? So this is what we'd established earlier. Sorry, the cat is causing chaos and destruction in the background. I'm not even going to look at that right now. But then they run into these various limits that we've been talking about in their ability to, further expand the gap from B to C. So fortunately for them, they have another strategy that's available to them, right? So they can find ways to decrease the hours from A to B to create room on the other end of the equation for more hours from B to C. So with that out of the way, on the level of geometry, the remaining question is, wait, how do we pull the conjuring trick of reducing the distance from A to B without violating our simplifying assumption that everything, including labor power, is always being sold at its full value? And that's an empirical question. So rather than reasoning about it in the abstract, Marx basically says, well, let's take a look at how capitalists have actually done this in the course of real history. And that's finally going to get us to the point where we have machinery and large-scale industrial production. So in chapter 13, remember, The capitalist was taking the actual physical production process as he found it, bequeathed to him by pre-capitalist forms of society. And the only improvement was bringing together some of those formerly independent craftsmen, now under his thumb, under the same roof to capture various benefits of cooperation. First, the capitalist is able to save time by not having to either himself or through his representatives go from house to house collecting, goods that are, being made in the home. Secondly, we've unleashed those animal spirits Marx was talking about from different people working around each other and thus being spurred to better results, which works for everything from, an 18th century workshop to two screenwriters who aren't even working on the same project, but might take their laptops to the coffee shop together for a writing session. And third, and most importantly, we could start to have a complex production process where different people are doing different parts very quickly. And this finally takes us up to the division of labor and manufacturing.
So you're going to be getting to the part about the terms of service and gender next, right?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Oh, Ben, you cut out.
Yeah, something with your mic cut out, Ben. We heard you for a second. There's too much political education going on.
That's done.
For a bit.
Yes,
but
there we go.
Now I'm starting to hear you, Ben. Yes.
Okay. Testing. I'm still good.
Yes.
Yeah, better than
okay. All right. Yeah, it's really disconcerting because I have no idea what's happening. This is happening before we started tonight too. But yeah, the terms of service are in chapter 16, and chapters 17 through 24 are about the men becoming women and playing in the WNBA. Which
I have to say that guy is like 5. He looks like maybe 5'6", which is I understand he was using hyperbole, but even for the WNBA, I think he actually would probably be shorter than maybe a point guard. That's my main objection to what I heard.
Yeah, everything else in the video was reasonable, but it's like you got off board with that part. It's like, wait, what? No, you couldn't make it in the WNBA.
Well, I was thinking also if there were more conservative rappers, I mean, and not just like casually conservative, but like that's their entire project. I feel like agenda to they gender would have been just like used so often, but like he got to maybe be the first because yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
That so, but I mean, it's like the reason it takes so many chapters is because first he has to explain what basketball is, because really people weren't familiar with that in Victorian England, and then what the NBA will be, and then what the WNBA will be, and so it really takes a long time to lay out the whole plan. And then yeah, there's the bit about throwing up your hand to hail Satan, and then after that he goes into the enclosures, right? Like it just kind of goes back to more what you expect.
After he just accurately predicts the future perfectly.
Exactly.
You're like, I agree with Marx about the results of the 1998 Chicago Bulls Utah Jazz finals, but he got 1999 totally wrong. He got the MVP. He got the MVP totally. Still impressive though.
Yeah, but there are certain things he failed to anticipate in that game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, that's that is exactly right. In any case, we before we get to the main event for tonight, we do have a couple things that we want to mention. One is, while we were talking about people selling their labor power to capitalists, Andy, we've got a petition for the workers at Smith College.
Yeah, there's a bunch of brand new unions at Smith College. One of them just formed on Wednesday, and they're asking people to sign up. Basically just sign on to a letter saying that you're in solidarity with them. and it's a Fort Hill preschool. It's basically a preschool part of the school. It's their teachers wanting better and fair pay, and they're trying to get the community involved. So this is your chance to tell Smith College, which is fighting tooth and nail against them, and I think 3 other brand new unions that formed on campus since December, if I remember correctly. It's impressive. Like it's the library union just formed. They RAs formed, and the student cafeteria workers formed, and they've also had for a long time the groundskeeper and cafeteria workers. Like that, they've been in a union for a while now. So nice to see this happening. Maybe now they'll inspire the teachers to unionize. But hey, we got the preschool teachers, so we're going in the right direction.
Working your way up to the college level. Yeah, I like it. So yeah, we have. I actually think I messed up and I did not put it in, but by the time the episode is over, the link to that petition will be down there in the description below you. And to answer Mercutio's question, are tonight's mic issues the consequence of the prior cat chaos? Entirely possible. I would not put it past him to have knocked something loose while he was jumping around. But I suppose I'm not, I suppose I'm not sure we can blame it on him or not. Innocent until proven guilty. Okay, so we were talking about economics, and we're going to get to the interview with Danny and Derek from the American Prestige podcast, which is about foreign policy. And I was thinking about how to do the transition here, because I think there are a few ways, right? And I think that the sort of very classical Marxist way of tying together those subjects would be talking about how you need to stop war so you can have international proletarian revolution, but if you don't think that's happening soon, and nevertheless, right, you have an anti-war position, it's worth thinking a little bit more about why, and and how to sort of how to explain the linkage between the two. And I think that there are a few ways that you can do that. I mean, certainly in principle, I mean, if the sort of core of your politics is about inequality and overcoming domination, then there are fewer sort of more extreme instances of inequality in the world today than what's manifested in war, right? That who gets whose life is worth anything, and whose isn't. In fact, since we we had to do this as a pre-record this morning, and since that happened, there's some pretty disturbing news about Lebanon and what looks to be a spiraling out regional conflict. But I mean, if you just think about, again, I mean, who's like who ends up being treated as completely disposable or not, right? I mean, like, again, just on that sort of basic normative level, that kind of inequality doesn't get much more extreme than that. I also think that, kind of staying roughly on the normative front, that, there's something to be said about democracy, right? That both in the sense of like what Danny's first book is about the rise of the defense intellectuals, about how about how the defense and intelligence component of the American state is the part that's by design most insulated from public opinion, right? I mean, certainly, I think Ukraine, which is going to be the focus tonight, is more divided, but I mean, there's a pretty solid majority. I mean, look, I'm under no illusions that most Americans think what I do about Palestine, but there's like a pretty solid majority that's like, yeah, we've given the IDF enough weapons, we could stop now, right? But it just doesn't matter, right? For what the policy is. So that's the domestic democracy point. But there's also a point about, that I think really comes up, in a striking way in the Ukraine case. But, you could look at everything from, the Vietnam War and, people who, ended up getting sold out at the end of the process there in South Vietnam, Hmong population, all of that, up through various wars in the Middle East, etc., and point out that even the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of American foreign policy, like never mind the people who are just obviously the victims of it, but even the people who are supposed to benefit from it, look, it's not like the by the nature of foreign interventionism, it's not like the American state is democratically accountable to any of those people, or could be, right? Which is important because ultimately, it's like, yeah, you have the big imperial colossus that comes in, says, it's going to fight your battles for you and it'll help you out. And then inevitably, public opinion moves on the home front, and, and sort of imperial self-interest moves on to the next conflict. And, somebody's always left holding the bag, right? I mean, that's just a really basic problem. And one that, that I wish people would think a lot more about when they're sort of vulnerable to what I end up talking a lot about to Danny and Derek about, which is the sort of idea that it's like, okay, like the empire is neither innately good or bad. Like it can be used for bad, it can be used for good. It's like, not really, right? Like the sort of allegedly good uses, I think there's some extremely predictable reasons why they end up turning to shit in the end. And those are, again, sort of abstract reasons, kind of semi-pragmatic. A lot of that's kind of normative, but also just, look, there is a sort of very, very basic reason. It's also referenced right at the beginning of the discussion with Danny and Derek that, I was thinking about, when I was on Rogan 2.5 years ago, like that conversation actually happened the day before the invasion of Ukraine. And that came up a little bit at the end of the conversation. And, in that context, I mean, I think I tried to lay out just one of the most incredibly basic points of connection, between the domestic economic stuff and sort of maintaining this world bestriding, global military presence. That's gotta override almost everything else right now, just in terms of like how important it is that we stop acting like this. I don't know why the United States has to have the kind of role in the world where we're, negotiating about what happens in Ukraine at all, right? Like why is it important that the United States have this, be like present in everything that happens?
It's a weird role
everywhere on the planet, when the United States invaded Panama, I think that was totally unjustified, but Gorbachev, wasn't like involving himself, in that, right? Because the Soviet Union didn't have that role in the world. And I'd rather that we didn't either. I'd rather that, like, instead of having like however many hundreds of military bases the United States has all over the entire, like every part of the world right now, and constantly fighting these like low-level drone wars that like most Americans have like forgotten that they're even happening, in distant countries. Like, I think that if we redirected the kinds of resources that we spend on having this role in the world to taking care of people's material needs in ways that, it wouldn't fund all of it, but it would do a lot. It would do. Yeah. Money, as I learned from Derek tonight, is fungible. So it turns out that the money that's spent on bombing Beirut could in fact be spent on helping people in Asheville or giving them health care. So that and many other insights. Let's do the main event. Let's play the interview.
Yeah, I saw people arguing about that on Twitter today, whether that's a right wing talking point or not. What you just said. Hopefully we clear that up.
Yeah. All right. I'm joined by Danny Bessner and Derek Davison of the American Prestige podcast. How you guys doing today? How's the Prestige of America doing?
Prestige of America is at an
never
all-time
been
high.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything is good.
Never been better.
Okay, I think we're good to go. Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. I've never recorded from this position. My beautiful baby boy is in frame.
Yeah.
He needs to see me every time I do something. But things are good.
I feel the same way. I've just learned to control it. Oh. So
He's doing
hey,
good.
there you go.
Hey,
Yeah. Well, this
But
is
no, things are good. Things are good. Everything's going great with American foreign policy. There's no problems in the world. We haven't just abandoned Asheville. Our producer's there, and he's having trouble communicating with him. And it's I was going to say interesting, but it's wild how the government has done basically nothing. There was this really annoying community note, which is like someone tweeted like they're denying Asheville aid, and the community was like, FEMA is not literally blocking aid to Asheville, so this is wrong.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it was ridiculous, and it just reminded me a lot of this stuff going on with Israel.
I saw some like people who were very intent on actually, and anyone who wanted to point out the gap between the lack of aid to Asheville and the money for various proxy wars going on right now. But I said, well, it isn't literally true that the FEMA budget is tied to, the bomb budget for Israel, which of course is clearly what you were suggesting here.
It's so annoying. Yeah. I feel like we're in like the ninth.
Money is not fungible. The Israel bomb money has to be spent on bombs for people.
Yeah, no, literally, it's in the law that if it's not spent on that, it has to be set on fire.
Yeah, like. Do you guys feel? I feel like arguments like that held more sway like 6, 7, even 8 years ago. They're just like zombie arguments now. It's just like wild. It just does not feel roughly effective at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's definitely a Team Blue contingent out there, but they're losing the margins in places like Michigan, and that's going to cost them, I think.
Is there a chance she's going to lose this election?
Oh
yeah, for sure.
I mean, absolutely.
So I haven't been paying it. Like I've been away. So where are we with that now?
So my understanding is that it's, kind of depends which week you're looking at the polls, and some obviously look a lot better for her than others, but it's basically seemed like a toss-up. I think that especially when you consider that both 16 and 20, Trump, the polls underestimated Trump. So,
right. He's always underestimated in the polls. Right? It's like a thing. Like there's like a Trump underestimation, exactly. Like that has been baked in for whatever reason, or his theory is supposed to be baked into these algorithms, but who knows if they're
exactly. It's like the sort of counterpoint is, in 2022, the polls underestimated Democrats, but like I also think it's a different dynamic because that was a midterm, and so whatever. If I had to bet today, I'd say Kamala probably wins, but like it's definitely not a sure thing.
Cool.
So, which does take us to you guys' article, right? So, because this is something that you mentioned in there. So the article is in National Interest. It's called "America Must Grapple with the Limits of Ukraine's Kursk Offensive," and in there, you make one of the points that you make is that the Biden administration has been super committed to the war in Ukraine, and really whoever wins, it's not clear, right, that level of commitment is gonna continue for the next like starting now or starting next year.
Yeah, well, Derek, you go first, because what do you think about like if Trump or Kamala is elected, because what's the difference between institutional inertia or the relative effects of institutional inertia and political inertia, and the war just not going well flat out for quite a while at this point?
I mean, you can't keep announcing like 8 billion here, 9 billion there when they're clearly losing, which you know, they're I don't want to overstate the difficulties that Ukraine has had, but they're not winning the big counteroffensive. I was actually a little bit surprised that the utter failure of the big counteroffensive didn't change public opinion more than it has. I think it's soured people a little bit, or it's increased support for peace talks. It seems like
right, some sort of
or
negotiation.
the sort of like, you know, we don't want this to be an unending spigot of money and weapons. Like there has to be some movement toward at least, you know, having conversations about how this ends. But you know, even if we assume that Kamala wins, the desire, the willingness to continue this indefinitely, I think is just not there. And if there's no hope of a settlement, or if it looks like the only thing that's going to happen the longer this goes on is Russia's position is going to strengthen, and it's going to be harder for the Ukrainians to make a peace deal that's even remotely favorable, not favorable, but acceptable, then you know, people are gonna see that. And I mean, obviously, if Trump wins, the money's gonna get cut off. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw his thing with Zelensky.
No, I saw him walk.
They couldn't have been
together,
more. I mean, they couldn't have been more kind of uncomfortable with each other. And Trump, you know, they did their like press thing at the you know, after they talked, and Trump was just openly like you know, talking about he's sure that Vladimir Putin doesn't want this to keep going on, and he can make a great deal with Putin, and Putin, and Zelensky's just standing there next to him, looking at him like, what are you talking about? It was very awkward, and I think you know, if Zelensky's hope was that he was going to sell Trump on this big victory plan that he's been shopping around to Biden and Harris, it clearly doesn't seem to have worked.
So Trump will, and do you think Kamala will just basically slowly turn off the spigot, not mention it? Like it's actually kind of interesting. Her campaign, and I would bet this would actually be an approach to public communication, is just like not going to say shit. It's very successful for them if they win. That is, they might lose, but if they do win, just like don't have her say stuff. Like, you don't actually need it
to anything.
Yeah, you don't actually need, it turns out like you don't need them
to commit to anything anyway.
Right, she doesn't have any core, you know, ideological core, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, I think they'll keep going, you know, as long as they can get away with it. A lot of it depends on Congress too. I mean, you remember how difficult it was to get the last aid package for Ukraine passed. That's probably going to get. Well, I mean, it depends on how things shake out. If the Democrats lose the Senate, which I think is almost a certainty, it would be very difficult for them to even get back to 50-50, given the way that the map lines up. They could, in theory, if Kamala wins and has coattails, they could maybe take the House. But if they don't have control of both chambers, then I think they're going to run into the same. It might be a little bit easier in the Senate. Who knows? Because the Republicans in the Senate are frankly just older. More, like they're less, right. They're more wedded to the institution, more Cold War type. So you know, that might make it easier for her to get more aid through Congress. But I think they'll just kind of like keep going, but maybe wind down. I don't think you're going to see a point where there's like a public statement like this has to end or we have to do something different. But you know, they'll sort of de-emphasize it as long as it continues to go in this kind of slow-moving Russian victory way, which is, you know, depressing to talk about for them and for their for the base.
Yeah, it is. I agree. But guys, quick thing, just to show how the sausage is made. You guys can't hear a clicking, can you? I think it's just in my ears. No.
I can't hear a clicking now.
Okay, great. Okay, great.
I don't hear anything.
No. So no, I totally agree with that, Derek. And so it'll be interesting to see. Do you think there's any chance that the failure of this war is going to reframe anything, because at this point, my entire adult life has just been the U.S. lurching from disaster to disaster. So like, is this it? Is this just the institutional inertia? Nothing could ever change. We're in hell world, as they used to say.
I mean, what's it gonna? What would it change?
Right,
Like
so we're in hell
they'll
world,
try
yeah.
as long as there is a Ukraine at the end of this that isn't, you know, if it ended right now, and the Ukrainians said, you know, whatever, you know, these parts of the Donbass and Crimea,
Yeah.
you know, we're not gonna say we recognize them as Russian, but effectively we're not gonna try to take them back. We'll just leave it as this kind of open sore. Then, you know, they'll claim victory. They'll say that the goal was always to conquer all of Ukraine and bring it back into Russia, and we saved them. And they'll say it was a very successful operation. And I think it'll just, you know, continue on.
Right. Even if the actual deal at the end of it is probably much worse for Ukraine than, you know, what could have happened in spring of 2022.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I
that
mean,
seems
you know,
almost
that's
accepted now. Yeah.
that seems pretty clear. But they'll ignore that, and they'll just go with the worst case scenario and say this is even though, you know, up to this point, the Ukrainians themselves, Zelensky and company, have been talking about total victory. That they won't get that, and they'll still kind of say, you know, we did it, everybody.
That is, so there's just no changing anything. If events have zero chance of changing things, what do we do?
Well, okay, so I wonder about that, you know, because, you know, I mean, obviously everything Derek just said is the ring of truth, right? That the sort of you know, is whenever the war does, you know, finally grind to some kind of bloody halt, then you know, there's going to be this way worse, you know, peace deal that happens now, but the narrative will be retconned. And, you know, and if you're sort of listening to mainstream media, or, you know, what most politicians say, you know, that'll just be the line, right? Like that sounds totally true. But I also wonder, I mean, if you think back to February of 2022, it really did feel like the way people were talking about Ukraine. I mean, this is kind of a revival of, like, I don't know, national purpose, right? You know, it's like, you know, people, like, you had this kind of level of excited liberal patriotism that, you know, I hadn't seen for a long time. And the fact that, you know, it went this dismally, I mean, even if nobody, like, you know, actually reckons with that fact, which, you know, people don't do that, right? But, like, you know, even if that's the case, I mean, does that make it harder to sort of whip up the same level of frenzy, you know, when the next thing happens in the world?
It doesn't seem to have, because, like, if you even remember in the run up to Ukraine, they were constantly arguing in favor of it. I remember I wrote something before the invasion, and it just, no one cared. It was very weird. Like, there was the entire left liberal part of the coalition just didn't care. Like, Iraq and Afghanistan had never happened, so why would it change?
Yeah, I don't. I'm kind of with Danny on this. I don't know. I'm very pessimistic, and it's not just about this. It's, you know, I'm sure we want to stick to Ukraine and not talk about what's going on in the Middle East. But
Well, I mean, we can certainly touch on that.
This is a very dismal time for
Well, that's the interesting historical question. And Ben, I think I told you about this piece, Imperialist Realism, I've got going out about it. Yep. That's the most interesting thing. You know, I'm actually reviewing Chomsky's book now. My big critique is, like, Chomsky's theory of politics is wrong, which is that information will lead to change. That is the fundamental assumption of his entire political career, and is fundamentally wrong. And, like, understandably, he's an elderly man right now, so he's not going to start rethinking things at 94 or whatever he is. But it was just fundamentally wrong. It's an incorrect assumption about how politics works in the 20th and 21st centuries. Maybe it was true at different times. I am a little doubtful, but whatever. So then, what do you do with that, right? And this is an ultimate problem for the left and left thinkers. And just to be honest, I think this is a major result a major consequence of a lot of the ennui and the nihilism that you see sweeping through the left. There's a truth to that ennui and nihilism, right? It's not coming from nowhere. It's not just coming from the loss of Bernie. It's coming from a recognition of the actual structure of power in American society, reflected by the Ukraine thing, where in the run-up to the war, all the left liberals who had been critical of Iraq and Afghanistan were just in favor of fucking arming Ukraine. It just did, and thereby strengthening the empire. So if nothing is going to change, then nothing's going to change, and that's the affect of the 21st century in which we live, I think.
Yeah. So in some ways, your take on Chomsky is like the sorry to bother you theory, right? Like I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if you watched.
I know
that
of
movie,
it, but I've
right?
never seen it. Yeah, with the horses and
yeah. There's a point in the movie where the big science fiction horror premise, the whole thing is very publicly revealed on TV, and then nobody does anything. And there's like even like kind of a line of dialogue about like, yeah, if you just tell people something really upsetting, but they have nothing to do about, but you don't really give them anything concrete, that they can do about it. They just kind of go back to ignoring it, right? Because what good is it going to do them to focus on it? But I mean, so your point, right? I mean, so like, and I mean Derek's point too. The counterpoint to maybe this went so badly that people draw some conclusions, is that look, there weren't very many months between the beginning of the Ukraine war and the after the end of America's 20-year debacle in Afghanistan. And it seemed like the theory of the case that a lot of liberals who had been opposed to Bush's wars in the Middle East, certainly at least Iraq, but maybe in general, and even a lot of people on the sort of liberal adjacent left, that a lot of their theory of the case was basically like, okay, well, those wars were bad because the empire was being used to do a bad thing, which was to invade other countries. But Ukraine is good because in this case, the sort of might of America's imperial global presence is being used to do a good thing, which is to save somebody from being invaded. And so the ideology there is that it's just sort of this neutral instrument that that sometimes happens to be used to do bad things. Of course, that's bad, but it could equally be used to do good things, and that would be good when it happens.
But that is just a totally naive understanding and ahistorical understanding of the entirety of U.S. history. So then, what do you say to someone like that, right? Like,
yeah, well,
there's just nothing to say. They're like, okay, that's totally wrong empirically, and one might even say theoretically, but more important, empirically. You don't get the good parts of the empire without the bad. So if you're not going to see that, there's only so much that I could say to you, So, and it feels kind of pointless, frankly.
I mean, the master's tools aren't going to be used to take down the master's house, basically. Like you can't count on all the wars being good wars from now on. Right. It's the institutions and the arms industry and the $1 trillion Pentagon budget. Those are the things that are the problem. And, look at what's happened. You had Ukraine and everybody, who was bummed out by Iraq and Afghanistan got to say, hooray, the United States is the good guy. Isn't this great? And then we turned around and backstopped a genocide in Gaza and, enabled the slide into war in the Middle East.
Right. So it's like,
this is what we do. This is
what
just
are you
what we
even
do.
arguing with, right? I'm just bored arguing with people like that because they're just not seeing reality. So you're not going to force them to. Ben, what do you think about this? Because your whole thing is about giving them an argument.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, look, I'm neurotically attached to the project. I mean, I'm still going to do it, but yeah, I mean, this is like. I think that this, this is one of the things that it's often hardest to convince people of because they're thinking of these as just sort of individual, policy decisions. It's like, domestic policy. you support this law, right? You oppose this law. If you're, if you're, banning, if you're banning same-sex marriage, that's bad. If you're banning child labor, that's good, right? Which I think is obviously a correct approach to take to domestic law. But the idea that the military industrial complex, to use the old-fashioned term, that the sort of that maintaining this level of American presence in the world militarily, that this could be a package deal that has that has consequences, that that's like that are going to reverberate in other parts of the world and other conflicts, that you have to at some point just pull back from the entire project. I think that is kind of a gestalt switch for a lot of people, and I think a lot of well-intentioned people, right? It's not just that there's sort of it's not just that there are people who are just like so hopelessly ideologically captured that that there's just like nothing you can do. Obviously those people exist too, right? But it is also the case that I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily starting from a place where they're just completely immune from the the appeal of a sort of anti-interventionist project or whatever, like are still very stuck in that way of seeing it, that this is just like domestic policy, that that you should, that you support the good things and oppose the bad things. And so I don't entirely know the answer, how to sort of convince people that.
Well, I don't think you can. Like the entire left liberal side of the spectrum was
That's
lined,
such a
like
level
people.
of delusion.
Yeah, it's just such a level of delusion and ahistorical ignorance that like it's absurd. Like I remember when I went on the Majority Report, and we haven't been invited back since.
Yeah, thanks
Sam
for that.
Cedar,
By the way.
yeah, Sam Cedar asked me like, "What do you do with Ukraine?" I'm like, "Nothing," and it like literally their audience like lost their mind. Like they could not like comprehend that. It was like so funny. Like people were freaking out. And it's just like that's just like someone who's lost, who has no appreciation for what actual empirical history shows you. It's just nothing is going to change that. And then beyond that, there are people I know we're all thinking of who are like on the liberal, like sort of the liberal side of the left liberal, like dirtbag podcast, all that shit. And they like lined up like totally 1-on-1 behind Ukraine. So like it just shows that they're not really part of your coalition. They're never going to be part of your coalition. The fact that they couldn't see that this is directly connected to something like the U.S. support for Israel is like, okay, what do you do in that situation? There's nothing to do.
I mean, to take to take an example that doesn't get a lot of headlines, but probably should. The United States floods the planet with weapons. Like we are by far,
which I talked about in that piece, Derek, I wrote for you,
around the world. And you don't get to have the $1 trillion military to do good things with, to wield like some kind of righteous sword and only do good things with, without building the kind of defense complex that demands the right for profits, for corporate profits, to sell those weapons all over the world. And so it's just impossible to have the one without the other. And if you think it's bad that American small arms are fueling, rampant gang violence in Mexico, or that we're, selling landmines or cluster bombs rather that are going to be, going off 20 years from now and maiming kids because they don't always detonate when they're supposed to. If you think those things are bad, but you think that the military, the $1 trillion military is good, you can't square that circle. It's just not. These things are intimately connected. You don't have one without the other. So, I mean, I don't know. People don't want to believe that. But again, I think it's a delusion. As I said earlier, it's a delusion. It's delusional.
Yeah. So this is. I mean, actually, I think the way that you just put it is really good. And of course, the whole discussion makes me think of the kind of stuff that Danny was putting out a few years ago, and much you know comparatively much less depressing times, right?
We had hope. We had hope, Leo. We had hope.
Yeah, exactly. As wheels always turning. Maybe by the time he's able to be aware of politics,
When he's fighting the climate wars, when he's like the John Connor of the climate wars, that's when I'm training him to be.
Exactly. Yeah. So at the but the stuff you're putting out back then was kind of a lot of it was about sort of how to navigate stepping back from empire, right? Like, so
Right.
if like Bernie Sanders had become president, and we got like the best possible version of the Bernie foreign policy, right? That how how you would do that. And I remember some of the conversations that I had with you back then were all about essentially the how to deal with that majority report question, right? Like, so because it's maybe even one thing, and look, I mean, if that were me, I mean, I probably would have emphasized the sort of like short-term answer. It's like, well, you promote peace talks, and that's actually going to be better for everybody, and blah blah blah, right? And
I got to give it to him hard, dude. Uncut, blow their minds.
That's all correct as far as it goes, right? But like, clearly in the long run, your answer has to be the right one, right? That, in other words, that like, yeah, whatever the United States, should concretely be doing in, Ukraine, or we could like go through different parts of the country where, you could at least see potentially really bad consequences from drawdown of empire, along with all the good ones. Then I don't know, the Koreas, whatever, like you go through all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, whatever the sort of short term, like, okay, here's what we could do in the next 6 months that, that would sort of manage that. It's like, look, you're either going to do a transition to not having a global empire, or you're not.
Right, or you're not. Right. And I think all these people don't actually want to, because I think they're infected with a ultimately religiously, but now secularized millenarianism. And that it just made me realize that like these people actually can't be comrades. Like, if the ultimate, I think one of Mike Davis's last things he wrote was like, down with empire now, down with empire yesterday, and down with empire forever, right? Like, that's like a fundamental thing, right? And if you don't have that fundamental thing, you actually can't really be part of a working foreign policy coalition. Maybe you could work on domestic issues together, but like a lot of there's just no coalition to be built if that is not your ultimate goal. If you don't see the connection between flooding weapons into Ukraine and the continuation of the US empire, which does things like send weapons to Israel, then what are we talking about? Then we're living in basically two realities. Maybe that's a strong way to put it, but what do you guys think about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You don't get to have one without the other, basically. Like, you can't. I mean, just on a purely political level, you would think people would get this, right? Like, you don't get to elect your faves every 4 years and have whoever it is. If it's Joe Biden, if it's Barack Obama, if it's Donald Trump. I mean, it doesn't matter. You don't get to win every time, and so there's always going to be a point at which the massive might of this thing that you think is should only be used for good is going to be wielded by somebody you think is bad, and they're going to do things that you think are bad, and sometimes they're going to do the same things that you would find good or praiseworthy if they were being done by somebody on your team. But nevertheless, like, it doesn't work. Nothing about this system works that way. Nothing about the way the U.S. operates works so that you can just get the goodies all the time without any minuses. It just doesn't. It's just not feasible.
To put a finer point on that, right? Like, look, if we, if we stopped having this massive arms production industry in the United States, we didn't have. We stopped being the kind of country that, that had hundreds of military bases around the world, that had this just unbelievable stockpile of weapons, which, and to, clear, right? I mean, it's like the commitment, certainly the dual commitment to the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza has actually like severely strained even that completely ridiculous stockpile of weapons, right? So it's like, if you didn't have all that, right, like if you had drawn down from all of that, by say 2021, then yeah, when you are in situations like February 2022 and there's like a local war that breaks out in some other region of the world, then the answer would have to be nothing at that point, because there would be literally nothing you could do, right? Just like there are any number of countries around the world that it's like they're just not particularly in a position to do anything one way or the other when something happens around the world. And so I think the question is, do you think that the world would be better off if we drew down the empire to the point where we were in that position where it's like, where whatever we thought morally we should do, there just would be nothing to do, or not, right? And I mean, I think all three of us think, yeah, very clearly that would be better, right? But
it's not even a question, right? So like, this is what's so annoying about like people getting so mad. It's just like they don't know, it's like they just don't know what the U.S. has actually done. Like it's not even a question. It's so. The times the United States has intervened in foreign regimes, the times the United States has flooded the world with weapons, the times the United States has prosecuted racialized wars that resulted in the death, destruction, and deracination of tens of millions of people over and over and over again. So what do you say to someone who's just like, you're just like, here's the history, and they're like, no, it doesn't say that. Oh, yeah, no, this time will be different. Like, okay, that's not like a serious thing. So then what are we even talking about? Let's go.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I mean, I think some of what you just said actually is a good thing to say. I also think that Derek's point earlier that I took some notes, so I make sure I did forget this. Money is fungible. That the same money that you can spend on the military could in fact be spent on other things. Like also seems like a relevant point for building public support for that position. But because I mean, it's like I remember
I'm going to copyright that. Money is fungible. I don't think anybody's ever said that before. I'm the first.
No, I think this is a new insight. Yeah,
money can be exchanged for goods and services.
Yeah, exactly.
We're breaking ground here.
Yeah, I mean, there's the. I remember, there was that tweet that was going around, well, when the United States, had, well, the within the last year version of when the United States started bombing Yemen is obviously not for the first time that ever happened, but like that was like a picture of a giant aircraft carrier, and it said like, the Houthis are about to find out why we don't have healthcare, and it's like, well. That is true.
Have they found out yet? It's months and months later. Have they found out yet? Because I don't know.
Yeah, it turns out we don't have healthcare, so we could pursue military ventures that actually aren't even successful. Right?
Yeah, that's it. That's the payoff.
Yeah. Good job.
No,
yeah,
it's wild. It's absolutely wild.
Yeah. So
the admission of that, like to have people who are ostensibly on the left of center, liberal or whatever, say we don't to make that connection. We don't have universal health care so that we can bomb this like remote country, tiny remote country that's been pounded by U.S. weapons for almost a decade now, so we can beat it up further. And that's the reason we don't have universal health care. That's astonishing that people would say that in a positive sense.
Yeah, right. And again, to put a fine point on this, right? Like didn't even work, right? Like it's
right. I mean, it didn't even. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And actually, so this really brings us to the actual article,
the actual problem, which has been, I need to get back on Majority Report. What are you doing to
contribute
to that
I'll work on that for you.
But tell them I'll come back on.
Derek's happy to go back alone.
Yeah, look, Derek,
like I've been on there before by myself. It went fine.
Right? Like that's
we actually pitched Derek. We wound up pitching them again, like when the war was going bad, in like an actual friendly way. I thought it would have been interesting to be like, let's actually talk about this, right? Like it seems so extreme, but once again, certain geniuses are proven correct over and over. So let's talk about that.
We invited Emma to come on our debate stream, which we're never doing again, but they were doing something themselves, so she couldn't do it.
Which debate stream? Did we do a debate stream?
Yeah, the first one, the Biden one.
Oh, the debate.
When we sat there for
yes,
2 hours and said, "Oh my God, is this man alive?"
Yeah, I
Like,
thought you meant me and you
as he
debating
died
someone.
on stage.
Yeah.
No,
Yes,
the presidential debate.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
presidential debate. Yeah. But they were
I
doing
mean, if
something. That
nothing
wasn't a
else,
slap.
I mean, look, if nothing else, I mean, it's probably, you know, long after the details of much more recent presidential debates have faded from my memory, right? You know, in decades, I'm still gonna remember watching it. It'll
Yeah, that was a memorable experience.
It's kind of like me and I saw Megalopolis. I'm like, this is one of the most memorable movie experiences in my entire life.
Yeah, so I hear. I haven't seen it. Yeah. Okay. So, so the actual, you know, article, you know, you're talking about the, you know, the limits of the Kursk offensive, uh, and this is, you know, and I think this does, you know, there is probably a way to talk about this that, you know, kind of brings in, like Derek had earlier been raising some of the analogies, you know, with the Middle East, because, you know, of course, you know, the disanalogy is that, you know, the United States is, in the Ukrainian case, you know, funding people who, you know, got invaded, right? You know, whereas
Right.
as the Palestine case, obviously very, very, very much, you know, not that situation, but you know, just the kind of dynamics of thinking that like the next thing is going to be when you achieve a military solution to like long grinding bloody conflicts, and you know, like forget all those, you know, naysayers, you know, who want you to negotiate, you know, just do the next thing, is, I think, one that, you know, you could see playing out, you know, a lot in both. And so, you know, this is, I think that like when this offensive, you know, started, like, you know, say, hey, look, man, all of you, you know, negative Nellies had been saying that this is like an unwinnable war, but look, you know, Ukrainians actually going into Russian territory, you know, they're so taking the initiative. So why didn't that work out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right. I think there's the dynamic of just give us this one more thing. Like, we just need permission for this one more thing. We just need F-16s. We just need to invade Russia. We just need the long range weapons, you know, and then we just need you to, you know, give us permission to use them, you know, more broadly. We just need you to promise us that we'll get into NATO. This is all like it's always the next thing that's going to win the war for the Ukrainians. And it's the same with Israel. Although the dynamic there is, if we just kill a few more people, this will be like, just let us kill this one more guy. If we kill Nasrallah, it'll be that'll end it. If we kill Sinwar, that'll end it. Or if we kill a couple thousand people in the Bekaa Valley, that'll end it. Like, it's just, you know, it's always just one more death away from paradise. But it's the same. Like, fundamentally, the process works the same way. What happened in Kursk, and I think we say this in the piece, and it's important to note this. Like, the Ukrainians achieved several real successes. I mean, what I think happened is that the invasion was started out as the means to achieve several ends, and it achieved some of them, but then it became an end in itself, and that's where we are now. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be. So the incursion, as I say, it achieved a number of things. It reinvigorated to some degree Ukrainian morale, which had been wavering since the failure of the counteroffensive, and with this steady Russian progression in the east along the front line, was flagging. It reinvigorated interest among the support network in the West, which, you know, like it or not, is fundamental to Ukraine's ability to defend itself at this point. They were able to take hundreds of prisoners. One of the things that the Ukrainians were worried about prior to this is that they had no more prisoners to exchange for the thousands of Ukrainian POWs that Russia still holds. And they took, I think, around 600 prisoners, and that fueled two major prisoner swaps. So these were all things that they achieved. There were other aims or other ends that they didn't achieve. I think they wanted a bigger kind of panicky Russian response that would have pulled a larger number of forces out of Ukraine to deal with this incursion. That didn't happen. The Russians continued to advance along the front line. In some cases, around Pokrovsk, for a while there, they were moving faster than they had before the Kursk invasion began. That's slowed down in recent weeks, but still, that the effect there, I don't think was what they had hoped for. The danger to me becomes, instead of achieving these aims, which you could have done, it seems to me, in an in and out kind of attack. We go in, take out the border guards, capture a bunch of prisoners, show the Russians that we can do this, that we're capable of it, show the West that we're capable of it, give everybody a shot in the arm, and then withdraw and just say, we can do this anytime we want at any point on the border. And that's, that to me is a even bigger threat than occupying the territory. But they stayed. So they're now occupying this, this portion of Russian territory along the border for who knows how long. I mean, the Russian response hasn't been particularly energetic, and I know there's been a lot of Kremlinology about that. Is Putin panicking? Does he not know what to do? I think it's more likely they just don't care. They're happy to have these thousands of Ukraine's most seasoned, best equipped troops sitting here doing nothing in this pocket of territory, just holding on to it. That's not relevant particularly to the Russians. It's certainly not as relevant as what they're trying to do in Ukraine. And so they're just allowing this to continue. But if they decide at some point not to allow it to continue, and they decide to go after, to drive these forces out or encircle them, which is the big threat, what are the Ukrainians going to do? Are they going to be prepared to pull these soldiers out before they lose them, or are they going to risk losing them? And that to me is the issue. And now that they're sort of committed to holding the territory, for what end, I don't know. I guess they think they can trade it in an eventual peace negotiation, right. But that seems incredibly unlikely that they can hold on to it that long, because we don't. I mean, who knows when that's even going to be a reality? The issue is they're committed now to holding on to this territory. So withdrawing will be seen as a retreat. It will be seen as a defeat, and it'll undercut all that morale stuff that the positive morale effects that the initial incursion may have had.
Aside for Derek's totally inappropriate criticism of the proud discipline of Kremlinology, I agree. And I do think that this suggests that the United States should not do things like this. Is that it's the old Clausewitzian principle. War is too unpredictable to just run into it headlong. But that's a lesson that's not going to be learned. So we face this weird affective thing I've been calling imperialist realism. And then the question, I think, for the left is, how do you get out of that? And that I have no fucking idea. Like that, I genuinely have no idea how that proceeds. I think Bernie was a Hail Mary pass, sometimes you catch those. This time we didn't. So then what do you do? And I genuinely have no idea.
Yeah. I'm still banking on Leo's John Connor moment and
his turn.
The 2040s. No, that's fair. So and I mean, this is like in some ways friend Kuba, who couldn't join us today, right? Like I saw him say that as a strategic thing, right? And I think this is separate from Derek's point about the sort of kind of immediate tactical upside as far as POWs to swap and even the sort of propaganda effects that just as like a move in the actual war. I mean, part of the reason that the Russians might have been relatively unprepared for this is it was a little unclear what the point was, right? That he said, it's a little bit like if Canadian forces were struggling to save Vancouver from American invaders, and they grabbed so Canada grabbed a truck stop and a little bit of prairie around Fargo. It's just like as a this is going to help us in the war. in more than the sort of tactical and propaganda sense, right? Like it seems like it seems like the thinking is a little bit unclear, unless Zelensky really does think that he can just like hold on to it, for long enough to swap it. But that's interesting in and of itself if he does, right? Because like that does suggest moving in the relatively near future towards towards a negotiated settlement, which has definitely not been the rhetoric very recently.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, Derek, do you think we'll
Yeah.
just grind on? What do you think is going to happen?
I mean, I think that the Russians are going to take the rest of Donetsk. And it's going to take a while because they're not moving fast, but they're moving in a number of directions, and they seem to be at the point where they can't move in on multiple parts of the line, but whatever part they decide to focus on in any given week, the Ukrainians can't defend all of it, so they just identify the area that they can push on, and they push, and they roll through villages and towns. I think they'll get to the extent of Donetsk, which would give them control of the full Donbass, and that's a point where they could say, not we're going to end. I mean, not that we're
Sure.
done, but that we're going to take a an operational pause or something, because they'd be quite happy, I think, at this point to have the Ukrainians come to them and say, okay, we can live with this. So I suspect they will kind of ratchet down the tempo at that point. And then the Ukrainians will have to decide what they want to do. I mean, there's still this idea of total victory. I mean, this is the plan, the big new victory plan that Zelensky's been shopping around. He took to Biden and showed to Kamala Harris and showed to Donald Trump, that apparently just includes like a bunch of stuff they've already asked for, like permission to use long-range weapons, which again is it's just the next thing, bro. Like, let me do the next thing, and then that'll be it. We'll win. And it also includes the NATO demand, which, if that was going to happen, would have happened a long time ago. They're not getting an assurance of NATO membership. So yeah, I mean, I just that move in particular, to me, and I don't want to like psychoanalyze Zelensky, but it seems very cynically to be setting up blame for defeat, not actually trying to establish the conditions for anything that could be called victory. It feels like something that you would do if you're trying to, if you want to be able to, at
You're
the end
setting
of
the
this,
stage.
point to the U.S. and say they didn't give us what we needed to win the war.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that seems right. So, I mean, this is, and we should say, by the way, too, it is worth noting in all of this, right? Obviously, the focus here is appropriately on, American foreign policy, but that, that there's like there's a Russian, equivalent to this conversation that's like, man, what do we, like, what do we get out of this, right? I mean, there's something that is like, like imperial ineptness is not only for the big guy, right? Like that this is like 2.5 years of like, maybe we'll keep grinding until we get all of the Donbass, and then there's some kind of settlement. I've got to think, from a sort of, why can't we have social spending in Russia perspective, that also feels pretty grim.
Well, as someone who's been personally sanctioned by the Russian government, I will not comment on the policies of one of the greatest countries in the world. But yeah, it's difficult to know. My understanding, Derek, is that it's actually difficult to know what's going on inside Russia. That it's just tough to know, and has been for a long time, and things like public opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's no good. What do you rely on, right? The media environment is very closed off. The polling, that always gives Putin, 99% or 80% support or whatever. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and there's no. I mean, one thing, there's no indication of what we saw at the beginning of this, which was even small kind of anti-war protests that were heavily cracked down on by the Russian state. I haven't seen any indication of that.
Yeah, it seems like
happening.
all that stuff was pretty effectively crushed early on.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how popular things are. You keep hearing about these like, Telegram channels that are secretly, kind of posting the real casualty figures and trying to shock people into like, this is not going as well as Putin says it is, and that kind of thing. But I have no idea if that has any effect.
Danny, what you just mentioned is, since obviously there's been a whole conversation talking about incredibly grim subjects, but you just mentioned one of the funniest fucking things that is true, that's happened over the course of the whole conflict. So for people who don't follow their Danny Bessner lore, that is literally true. Who's personally sanctioned by Russia? How the fuck did that happen?
I think it was random. Like, I think they had to fill some quota. Like, actually, I think they just had to fill some quota. And so I was a victim of that quota filling, of bureaucracy. Once again, I was a victim of bureaucracy.
So there's like somebody at the Russian analog of the State Department who's just like, okay, I need to find 5 more American commentators to sanction, and he's like doing a bunch of Google searches. And he reads like 2 sentences of something he wrote. It's like, whatever, good enough.
I don't even think he read. I think it was just on a list of international relations professors.
Fair enough. Well,
yeah, I don't think this was like thought out at all. I think like they had to get 200 Americans. They went through a list of international relations professors, and I was on that because most Americans do believe, most professors of international relations, I don't know, that might be strong enough, agree with the U.S. hegemonic project, so it's not exactly crazy. But Ben, we got to go. We got another interview, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, sanctioned in sanctioned by Russia.
Sanctioned.
Yes, sanctioned by Russia, but not by this show. Thanks, guys.
All right, bye, guys.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So that is Danny Bessner and Derek Davison of the American Prestige podcast. Check them out. Always worth listening to. Really enjoyed that conversation. Derek, Danny, Leo, insightful commentary from all 3 of those gentlemen. Yes.
I got to say though, does the Majority Report in Russia share a sanctioning list?
That's how he. Yeah, I want to know if the last time he was invited on the Majority Report was before or after the Russian sanction list came out, because maybe they've got Sam Cedar on retainer, telling them who to sanction.
Quite possibly.
No, that continues to crack me up. It's obviously completely meaningless. It's not like Danny has bank accounts in Russia, to freeze, but that they, again, imperial ineptness, not just for the big guys, it's the, when the US and Russia are doing tit for tat, sanctions on individual citizens. They ran out of all the people that they actually have any, actually make sense on any kind of geopolitical level. And some guy, with Google was just like, I don't know, Daniel Bessner. Okay, put him on the list.
Well, you maybe wouldn't want to have a connecting flight through Moscow, right? If you were sanctioned by the Russian government, or would that not even be a major problem?
That's a really interesting question. I have no idea if that's the. I don't know. I will also say, I've never had a layover in Russia. I don't know where you have to fly.
I actually did. And where I was going is really sad. I was going to Berlin. It's not sad I was going to Berlin. It's sad that the organization I was going with could only afford me a flight where first I flew all the way to Moscow and then I flew and then I went to Berlin.
Sounds
about right, right? For the amount
Edward Snowden famously had a connecting flight through Moscow, but I mean, I think that's because he was like actually trying to go on a crazy zigzag course to confuse pursuers, since it was never his intention to seek asylum in Russia. It's like literally just where he was when they took away his passport. Yeah, exactly. Snowden's layover is going on something like 10 years now. See, this is why I don't want layovers in Moscow anyway, whether I'm sanctioned or not.
Stuart McGill says Eric Adams says Turkey is the place to lay over. It's gotta be Istanbul, right? Eric, what was the quote? He said, first stop is always Istanbul. That's Eric, direct quote from Eric Adams, I believe. But it's a great place to launch an election campaign from.
Yeah, I know he's made many claims about how New York is the Paris, Athens, Rome, etc. of the United States. I don't know if he's ever claimed it was the Istanbul.
He did. I saw it. I saw it in the supercut with like a bunch of other ones. He didn't like mutter under his breath, which is also where I'm actually personally corrupt. But I like that but he literally, there's no pause, you know what I mean? Like there's no like poker tell that he had any special relation with Istanbul. He said it in the exact same tone of voice as he said, whatever every other capital. So I got to give that, he's a premium bullshitter.
Yeah. Oh, fair enough. Respect for the mayor. This is a pro Eric Adams podcast, as always. Yeah, no, exactly. I may have been sanctioned by certain elements of the online left, but I also don't bank with them or do layovers in their territory. So
this is like when you ended up on the post left watch list or whatever that.
Yeah, post left watch, which is amazing. That that account, presumably, what I gleaned from the title exists to keep track of something called the post left. It's like, I don't know, man. I'd write for Jacobin. I'm a member of DSA. I didn't see that. Doesn't seem very post left to me.
They're all post left by now. You gotta keep up.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what left is, but it's not that anymore.
Fair enough. In any case, before any foreign powers reviewing the program feel the need to sanction this show, we are going to go to the post game for patrons. We've got Walter Block's thoughts on the nation of Japan. We have all sorts of good stuff coming up. So if you are already a patron, you should have that link already in your inbox. If you are not, there's no time like the present. Patreon.com/Ben Burgess. And for $5 a month, you're going to get access to these patron exclusive post games and the Discord server, sometimes early access to things before we give them to everybody. And most importantly, you help to recoup the lost income from when the show's Belarusian bank accounts were frozen in the last sanctioning. So,
wait, real quick, I have breaking news. The New York Times editorial board has endorsed Kamala Harris for president.
No,
wow, this is gonna swing. Wow, it's gonna swing things. This is big. So we'll probably have to unpack that in the post game for over an hour and a half, like what led them, the battle that probably went in. But they're going with Kamala, they said.
Yeah, I got an email from the New Yorker saying that they too had endorsed Kamala Harris.
Whoa.
I think that was worth an email, but I mean, I would just like to think that that there was that would be that like this is just, there was so much doubt about this, right? That like there was so much tension about who would get the coveted New Yorker endorsement.
I mean, it's gonna be one of those
like this is gonna be, once that dropped, I mean, Donald Trump was gonna spend like 2 weeks rage tweeting about how the New Yorker has been garbage, since the failing New Yorker like hasn't been on its game since John Updike was publishing there. Like it's just total trash now. He's been saying it, and it's time to say it. It's very sad, that they but apparently, yes, we are prepared. You heard it here first. The New Yorker and the New York Times, neither of their endorsements are going to Donald Trump. I would assume, I don't know if 538 has updated their model in light of this new information, but
how about New York Magazine? Have they made any announcements yet?
We're waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah, I'm holding out for that one.
I'm monitoring it very closely. And yeah, don't worry. I'll have my eye on the push notifications when we talk when we go to the post game.
Okay. All right. Well, for updates on that and many other things, we'll see you in the post game. And yeah, if you like the show, it really is a way of showing appreciation. It's solidarity. Everything's thank you for that. So do consider it. Patreon.com/Ben Burgess. And if you are already a patron, we will see you in just a moment. Left is best.